Likewise.
Matt, you must be recording every person you talk to because your conversations are coming out like once a day, it seems like.
Yeah, I mean, my general policy is to say yes to as many requests to have these types of chats as I can. Um, there are a lot that I haven't even, I mean, that I haven't got to.
Yeah.
But I live for this, so yeah, and hopefully I'm not overwhelming people on my Substack.
And do you prefer Matthew or Matt?
Matt's fine. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Good.
Well,
Yeah,
I've just as a one starting comment for myself, I want to thank you for being prolific because yeah, the fact that you've been so prolific like has been a big door for me in the last year. As just finding your content at the right time for me and having there be so much of it. I've consumed a lot, so it's been great.
Great. Well, I hope it's nutritious. I guess for me, knowledge just is inseparable from communication. And so if I'm not trying to express ideas in dialogue with others, I feel like I can't really know anything. And so hopefully it's a contagious sort of view. And yeah, glad to hear it's been helpful for you.
Well, that's my aspiration for this conversation.
Let's do it.
And I mentioned briefly in the Substack chat that Adam and I have both been looking at quantum information theory a lot
Right.
in particular, and talking through the quantum enigmas dating back to Wolfgang's work. So I learned about you when you interviewed Wolfgang. I worked very closely with Wolfgang for a couple of years, and I'm the one who got him online. I got him an iPad and
Oh, thanks for
and
doing
got
that.
him online, and I ran his foundation for a couple of years, and I did some interviews with him, with John Vervaeke and Jonathan Pajot, and yeah, we worked together very closely for a couple of years, and I have like probably 100 hours of recorded conversations with him that I really want to get transcribed. And
Is all of that online already, or most of
I
it
haven't
isn't?
posted it online. No,
Oh,
it's,
wow.
they were private conversations,
Sure, sure.
lots of
So,
Zoom conversations, etc.
mm,
And I started like a weekly like discussion group around him when we were working together. And there was quite a cluster of interesting people who were interested in his work, who were all like um, visiting with him, but visiting with each other
mm.
online too. And I have a bunch of those meetings as well.
Well, it's wonderful to hear that. That type of archival work is so important and probably underappreciated and underfunded. And but it's great that his work can will continue to have influence even after the passing of his physical body. His ideas will certainly live on.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so. And I hope to play some role in that as things progress.
Mm.
So it was interesting to me that you interviewed him, and the Whitehead connection with is
Right.
obviously a point of intersection. And yeah, one of the
Yes.
things I'm interested in is like where you see your views of Whitehead overlapping with Wolfgang's and where you see differences.
Yeah. Well, that's a great topic. I wished I had had more time with Wolfgang to dig into that because I think he's both positively influenced by Whitehead and particular Whitehead's idea of the bifurcation of nature
Yeah.
uh, between the
Yeah.
sort of quantitative approach of the empirical sciences, which develop these mathematical models of the so-called primary characteristics, and then the all of the what Whitehead called the psychic additions that, from a materialist point of view, would be dismissed as just secondary characteristics that are
Mhm.
the qualitative aspects.
Yes.
that are just in the mind, and the mind is epiphenomenal. And that whole bifurcated picture is something Whitehead rejects, and Wolfgang clearly rejected that as well.
Yes.
But then there's a very important difference between Wolfgang's approach, which is, I think, more in line with the kind of emanationist scheme, say, coming out of Plotinus or Plato, or this perennial tradition, where this idea of evolution, which is so important for Whitehead, is, I think, for Wolfgang, could only ever be a kind of appearance, mere appearance. Time and history are, and the sort of creative unfolding of novelty, as Whitehead would describe it. Seems to me Wolfgang would say that that's could only ever be a kind of Maya, because what's real is this one eternal underlying wholeness.
Yes.
See, Whitehead's never denying that, but he's trying to, I think, Whitehead's a pluralist, he says, not because he denies unity, but he's trying to allow for manyness and oneness, to have some kind of parity, and that the many is not opposed to the one. And I know there's a way in which one could read this Platonist and Neoplatonist understanding of the one as also inclusive of the many. But Whitehead really does emphasize process, and he's trying to throw the one and the many into a creative advance where, yes, eternity is with us and fully present in each moment, but also each moment is new, and something is evolving, something is unfolding. And for Whitehead, even the divine doesn't know what's going to happen next. And so there's an element of the temporal that I think, and the evolutionary, that Whitehead wanted to preserve. And this is an evolution that's very different from Darwin's, and especially the neo-Darwinian picture of evolution, which I know Wolfgang had a lot of criticisms of, and I share his criticisms of that. But I think there's a deeper form of evolution that's not just that specific scientific paradigm that Wolfgang rightly criticizes.
Adam would agree with you.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I think that's the basic difference, right? And maybe there are others too, but that's the one that immediately comes to mind. And Wolfgang and I did touch on this a bit towards the end of our conversation, but I wished I could have gone a little bit deeper with him, because
I actually
he's
only just
Catholic, right?
listened.
And so history has to be really important. The Bible is an account of a historical process. So anyways,
I only just listened to that conversation yesterday because I think Richard had mentioned that it happened, but I had kind of forgotten. And I was just thumbing through your YouTube list and saw it. And one of the things that really surprised me that I think was a difference is, he talked about vertical causation, and he said that it was instantaneous. That was what kind of perked my ears up. Which, because
Yeah.
not to get in the weeds of the backgrounds, but, did a physics PhD and was trained as a scientist, right? So I have these kind of roots that are very much still from the academic and the institutional view of science. So anyway, instantaneous causation was one of those things that makes the ears perk up. But I think ultimately one of the questions I wanted to get at, and you dove right into it here, is what you thought, like elaborate more on where you guys started on that conversation of what you thought the difference between how you view whatever form of causation you would want to call it, from Whitehead's view of concrescence, or however you want to take it, compared to what you thought Wolfgang was talking about with vertical causation.
yeah, well, Whitehead develops this whole elaborate metaphysical scheme with all of these different concepts and categories, like ingression and prehension and concrescence, and so there's a lot there to unpack in order to really understand what he's talking about, as there is with Wolfgang's work and what's meant by vertical causation. But I think in an effort to bring forms of causality, and namely formal causality itself, back into the scientific picture, we're going to need to speak in a new way. And so, the modern scientific paradigm has been primarily mechanistic, and so has only allowed efficient causation, which is a kind of, you could say like push from behind type of causality, which is deterministic.
Wolfgang would call it horizontal.
Yeah, exactly, horizontal causality. And this is a reaction against, this more medieval scholastic or Aristotelian understanding where nature is, yes, there are efficient causes, but there are also formal and final causes, which is to say, the shape and the morphology of things plays a role in what happens and isn't simply reducible to um, efficient or horizontal causality. And similarly, these um, shapes are uh, have a reason. They're purposefully um, shaped and actively engaged in the realization of some kind of aim or value. And the modern scientific view had to stuff all that stuff, form or ideas and purposes, stuff it all into the human soul, and leave nature just uh, naked mechanism. And what quantum physics is suggesting, what the complexity sciences are suggesting, is that we actually can't understand nature. Like we tried to apply the mechanistic paradigm as rigorously as we possibly could, and we ended up discovering non-local entanglement. Uh, right. And so how do you explain that mechanistically? Well, you can talk about hidden variables and try to do a move like David Bohm and maintain a kind of holistic determinism ultimately, um, unbroken wholeness at the global scale. Um, or you can talk about vertical causality in Wolfgang's sense. But what Whitehead ends up trying to do is rather than emphasizing the wholeness of um, the the totality or the universe at the macro scale, he also wants to emphasize the wholeness of each individual actual occasion. And so, in other words, if you know the infinite, the genuinely infinite, is not separate from the finite. And so, in Whitehead's view, each of the particulars, so-called, contains the entirety of the universe, right? Every actual occasion physically prehends the entirety of the past and conceptually prehends everything that remains possible in relationship to that past. And so, in a way, Whitehead's taking this emanationist emphasis on the one that you find in Neoplatonism, and he's uh, inserting it into each of the many, and allowing for this recapitulation of oneness uh, in each of the particulars, so as to give rise to an evolutionary cosmology that's also constantly reuniting itself with that macroscopic whole, uh, but doing so in a way that adds to or allows for the growth of that one, right?
Mm.
Um, and so Whitehead would talk about not so much vertical causation as he would the ingression of eternal objects, I think would be the closest equivalent in Whitehead, which is the way in which each of these unique particular occasions of experience is relating to the one eternal truth, right? We relate to that through this, what Whitehead calls ingression, which is in a way our participation in the eternal. But we're always participating in the eternal from a new perspective, moment by moment. And Whitehead wants to say where our decisions are feeding back on that eternal realm and allowing it to grow so that it's not simply a static eternity, it's a living eternity. Um, so that's very condensed, but I think it's my attempt to begin to articulate the different. I mean, there's a shared goal between what, Wolfgang was attempting with his idea and what Whitehead's attempting, but I think they have a different emphasis, at least, if not some more underlying fundamental difference. It's at least a different emphasis.
Yeah.
Does any of that make sense? How's that landing
Yeah.
with you guys?
No, it made a ton of sense for me. Again, I have the advantage of having been well steeped in your language here in the last 12 months. So yeah.
Matt, I'm interested how you came to be doing what you're doing. Like
Mm.
what's your background? Why are you doing this?
I mean, I I love wisdom, I guess. Um,
Mhm.
and that's a path that
When
began
did
for
that
me.
start for you? Was that
High
early
school,
or
really.
high school?
I mean, in a conscious way in high school, but
Hmm. Hmm.
I think I was always a quiet, reflective kid.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, I knew pretty early on. Well, before my senior year of high school, I was pretty convinced I was going to be a professional hockey player. But
Ah.
I stopped growing. I
Uh-huh.
at about 14 and peaked at about 5'5", and so it wasn't going to
Hmm.
be in the cards. But
Hmm.
luckily, I started to like reading and discovered this. I remember realizing at some point early on, maybe junior or senior in high school, and reading different books that in psychology and philosophy, like there's this whole story, this whole history that would provide context for the ideas that I'm reading. Because when you first start getting into philosophy, it's daunting. It's like what the hell are these people talking about?
Yeah.
But you read a little bit more about the ideas that are in the background of an idea you just read about, and then like this whole
Hmm.
thread, you know, uh, you discover this thread that you begin to pull on, and eventually, I had read 4 or 5 different histories of Western philosophy, and then I realized there's Asia and all of those traditions that go back even further, um, and I think I just got addicted on some level to understanding um, and the infinite context of language. And I love reading. I feel like I love reading even more today because of the way that um, the human attention span is such an endangered species right now, and I feel like those of us who like reading have a duty to preserve it, and to try
Hmm.
to convince others that it's worth preserving.
Hmm.
So it just feels like more important. It's not just me at home on my couch reading a book. It's like an act of
A
cognitive
revolutionary
resistance.
rebellion, resistance.
hmm
Yeah, nice.
So yeah, I don't know. I just
And
can't
did
help
you
myself.
go to that place in Oakland, that institute there in Oakland, California?
For graduate school, and I went to it's in San Francisco. It's called the
Okay.
California Institute of Integral Studies.
Integral studies, right.
Yeah.
Okay. I went to Berkeley
Nice. And you
and
studied philosophy there or
I studied
physics or
math.
math?
I
Okay.
did a little bit of philosophy, but I studied math there.
Great.
And yeah, I left, I took a year off after my sophomore year, and I considered going to the California Institute of Integral Studies. There,
Hmm.
I looked at it before I decided to go back and finish my math degree at Berkeley.
Yeah, well, that's very
I
different
was
from a math degree.
interested in
Which
these
program did you
topics way back then. Yeah.
Which program do you remember that you were looking at CIS? Was there a particular one or?
It was, I mean, this was a while ago. It was like late 80s. So,
Oh, okay.
yeah, I
So
can't,
East-West psychology might have been there at that point.
mhm, yeah.
Um, my program didn't exist until 94, so
Hmm.
it wouldn't have been the philosophy program.
Yeah. Um, so what did you study at there? What was
I
your
studied
program?
I studied cognitive science as an undergrad, and then I
Yeah.
studied I enrolled in a program that I now teach in called Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness.
Okay.
Mhm. That was started by Richard Tarnas,
Hmm.
the philosopher and cultural historian, and Brian Swim, the cosmologist, was
Hmm.
faculty there when it started, and Robert McDermott, and it's
Did you
yeah
ever
now
come
it's
across Jacob Needleman
oh yeah,
in
actually he taught a
the
course
Bay Area?
that I took. I know he was at the San Francisco State University, but
Yeah.
at least for the latter part of his career. But he taught a course for CIIS for my department when I was a grad student that I got to take with him on the Buddhist teacher Milrepa and Meister Eckhart.
Yeah.
So I did get to spend, it was like a week-long course with Professor Needleman. It was a very special experience. Yeah.
Yeah, he was a big influence for me.
Mm.
I read his book, The Heart of Philosophy, when I was it's probably in my junior year. And at the time, I had gotten interested in Gurdjieff
Mhm.
and Uspensky,
Mhm.
right? And Uspensky was a mathematician and kind of came at it in this very logical way. And then I had read Jacob Needleman's books, in particular, The Heart of Philosophy. And then one day I was on Telegraph Avenue and I walked into Shambhala Books, and Jacob Needleman's books were in the Gurdjieff section. And I said, like, what are Jacob Needleman's books doing in the Gurdjieff section? and he said, oh, well, Jacob Needleman's a Gurdjieffian. And I was like, he is? Oh my God. Okay, I have to learn more about this. And that sent me down a path for 20 years or so
Mm.
of what I might call empirical spirituality.
Sure. Yeah.
And now I'm Catholic.
Okay.
And
Did you start out Catholic? Were
I
you
did
raised
not
Catholic
start
and
out
you became?
Catholic.
Oh,
No, I
interesting.
converted to Catholicism. I attend a traditional Benedictine Latin Mass abbey.
And how long
And
ago did that conversion
it was
happen?
about 10 years ago.
Okay.
And Wolfgang was a big part of that conversion process for me. I was already Catholic, but I was sort of, I'd say I had one foot in and, you know, one foot sort of at least looking out the door, you know.
I see.
But Wolfgang really, um, I always say he allowed my mind to finally acquiesce to what my heart said was the right thing to do.
Mm. Mm.
And that came from, I mean, it wasn't just him, but it was really finally seeing that this science-based perspective on the world, which I would call the observer-independent perspective on the world, right, and on our experience, um, is just limited. It can't provide all the answers. It can't answer all the questions. It cannot present a complete solution, and it can't disprove any of the other alternatives out there,
Mm.
right? It can't disprove Catholicism. Um, it is fundamentally incomplete in the way that everything is incomplete, you know,
Yeah.
in the Gödelian sense of incompleteness. But particularly this observer independent approach that we've had to the world through, really kind of most closely expressed, I guess I would say, by the idea of Cartesian bifurcation and Cartesianism, right? Like the idea that we can sort of look out on things in this objective way, and treat everything as though it has a reality that is independent of us, and we can analyze it and we can, poke it and prod it and ultimately kill it.
Yeah.
and and then somehow have Humpty Dumpty put all the pieces back together again to get an emergent, quote unquote, whole, which now we're going to do in this artificial intelligence, semi-parallel reality.
Right.
That this whole scientific mindset has permissioned and really endorsed and blessed. So this is where Adam and I get into it sometimes. Adam is, don't you speak for yourself, obviously, Adam, but we're on the same page in terms of um, the futility of that independent, observer independent approach to reality, right? And its failure. And then, you can take it, and I think this is getting back to kind of Wolfgang versus Whitehead too. And this is something I'm interested in hearing both of your responses to, but to me, even with, I can see that Whitehead's doing something different. I haven't really studied Whitehead, so I can't really say that I'm intimately acquainted with what he's doing. But it all feels to me like we're trying to preserve this idea of observer independence and of science, right? In this way that we can sort of look at everything from a distance, you know?
Yeah.
And so like Adam and I have talked a lot about quantum mechanics and then I mentioned in Substack, I know you may or may not have followed up on it, but there's a series of talks by this man named Chris Fields.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I know his work.
Okay, so Chris, he did a series of talks with the Active Inference Institute on quantum information theory, where he really kind of, the technical term is, uses the Wick rotation, and takes quantum mechanics into the information realm, right? And where energy and time, and Adam, you can correct me here if I'm mischaracterizing this. It's actually something I want to make sure I don't get wrong. But through this transformation, this rotation, energy and time kind of become measurement itself. And then pretty much all the ideas, all the things in quantum mechanics can be expressed as information theoretic ideas, right? Or expressions, they have counterparts. And so you have this idea of the quantum reference frames and the quantum measurements, which to me is something pretty darn close to bifurcation, you know? And and to and the fact that that quantum measurements are characterizable by finite bit strings. They can be fully described by a finite bit string, whereas a quantum reference frame cannot. And so they called this like fungible and non-fungible information. Another person used the terms speakable and unspeakable information, which I really like those terms. The idea of unspeakable information is like, yes, I like that. And so Adam would say like, well, the quantum world is kind of computing. It's doing its own form of computing in a non-classical way. And then, we here in any moment of time are, we're bound by the classical computing constraints, like what we can do here, we can only exchange speakable information. These computers can only communicate in speakable information. In spite of how amazing all this is, it's all a finite bit string. And yet there's something going on in the quantum world that looks a lot like computing. We would call it computing with probabilities, but it's not quite computing. And so, and Adam, maybe you can take over from here and kind of describe how, you understand it and other physicists understand it, like this idea of computation versus computable, computational versus computable, infinite bit strings and non-halting computers, right? So that's one response to, and it's a response that's consistent with science, right? But I don't think we're bound to that response. I don't think we're bound to, and I guess what I started out talking about was how that response is still kind of this, like, let me examine this from a distance, you know, approach to the world, you know? And so going back to Wolfgang and a love of wisdom, a philosophia, right? That's a very participatory aspiration. And I think that's what our, pre-Cartesian most intelligent people were doing. You know, they were attempting to have this impossible coherence and yet, you know, and still like preserving this this sense of qualities and this sense of, you know, I mean, in Wolfgang's first book, Cosmos and Transcendence, when he rewrote the introduction to it, he said, the thing I object to the most is that science says the world is unperceived and unperceivable, you know? And then there's these two ideas of immanence and transcendence, you know, or I should say transcendence and immanence. And, you know, we've forgotten about the transcendence. And so for me, like one of the most important things is, you know, and Chris Field says this, the ultimate quantum reference frame is a person. You know, you take that, it's not an infinite regress. It always stops at the person. Okay. And that is really key. And if we take the person seriously, if we take the person as, you know, where it all stops, right? We have to deal with that. And this idea that we can have sentient computers is so like awful to me. You know, it's so dehumanizing. It's so against everything that I hold dear and everything that I want to go deeper into in my life, which is mostly my relationships with people. So that's what I'm troubled by, you know, and even though I get all the intellectual arguments and I get the resistance to Catholicism, but I also hear people constantly saying, I was listening to Ian McGilchrist the other day, and, you know, or Eric Weinstein and Chris Martenson, or even Adam and my mutual friend Ben Hunt. There's all of these like wistful mentions of religion and of Catholicism, even in particular, where everybody's just for some reason it's like, well, that's just off, you know, off limits to me. Like that's just out of the question. I cannot consider that. That's history. I would never like, and I can't go to church, you know, I can't do that. And yet to me, it's like it is our heritage, our inheritance in the West. Like that is the place where people like Augustine and Aquinas and Bonaventure and you know, Wolfgang's biggest hero was Eckhart, Meister Eckhart, right? Like these were really integral, speaking of integral studies, right? These are real integral beings, and I think we've lost that integrality. And you know, McGilchrist, who I've just started learning a little bit more about, has really connected that to the left brain, right brain phenomenon, or you know, science. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
I guess one thing to
Adam.
say, I don't know if I, you know, curious to hear Matt's thoughts, I guess. on what you said, but one of the things that I heard in the talk with Wolfgang and you yesterday, Matt, that another thing that kind of perked my ears up was Wolfgang had this very binary view of being and non-being, which I think was, you know, caught up in all the Platonist ontology. Whereas I think, you know, for me, a process relational view of being and non-being has been much more gray and kind of, you know, like it starts somewhere, or maybe it's not even right to say start somewhere, you know, that there's sort of this spectrum of being and non-being, but there's not really non-being, you know. So anyway, one of the things that Richard, he was getting into the roots of quantum mechanics there. I've seen you talk about Carlo Rovelli's work, Matt, and I guess I wanted to, you know, another kind of quick personal comment is I think I'm indicative of something. And I say this to try to like not toot my own horn too much. You know, I came to what I think now is very much a process relational view, but it was pretty much on my own from within the sort of traditional scientific view. And the way that happened is that quantum gravity and most of what I've seen as the quantum gravity approaches are kind of discovering essentially a process relational ontology, you know, at the root of quantum mechanics. And so even though I was in this very, you know, institutional view of it, I still was kind of coming to this relational ontology through that view. I think that says something not about how smart I am or anything like that. It says something about how things that have been latent in the past are starting to become less latent, I think. And that says something about the cultural paradigm in general, which, so now, you know, at the risk of opening up other rabbit holes, like the way I discovered your work, Matt, was really more through the meta-modern work, you know, and so like through Brendan Dempsey and some of those guys, you know, I kind of was looking for an umbrella to like, how do I take these views I've come through from science and physics that are inherently relational and like wrap some kind of umbrella over those? Because I wasn't finding that in science, obviously, other than, you know, the very like specific view of like a quantum, you know, something very scientific like quantum gravity. So anyway, metamodernism has been another thing in the last 12 to 18 months that I've been very deep in. I think, like I said, that's where I sort of came across your work was secondary. So with all that said, I think this kind of view of being and non-being as being something where being, you know, both comes out of non-being, but also like concretizes or grows in time, and that's how novelty arises in the universe. You know, that's kind of been my answer to Richard, is that I don't think it's right to view quantum mechanics as not real or not possessing being. But I do think it's right to think that the process of, you know, complexification results in things that have a higher degree of being, you know, than some of what we might call that kind of, you know, quantum enigma or the strange behavior in quantum mechanics. I also have to say, Matt, I don't know how, you know, deep you got into Carlo Rovelli's work or relational quantum mechanics, but I've heard you say so many things that I'm like, that's amazing that Matt came to the same conclusion, but from the philosophy side. It's exactly what you already said about the story you found in philosophy and how, you know, this quote you're saying a lot lately of science is the history of science, philosophy is the history of philosophy. In science, I followed this story and I understood the story very deeply for a long time. And as I've started to dive into philosophy from a very, you know, superficial understanding before, I'm like, oh my God, the story, like it's the same story on both sides. And the way that that gets viewed through a different institutional lens, you know, within academia or even within, you know, more mainstream cultural institutions, I think is another place where Richard and I, it's like your first reaction to an issue tends to be either your kind of core belief or something that you've heard from a cultural institution. These institutions take these ideas that we're talking about and turn them into something that is not what was, you know, not the intent at the beginning. I just listened to Brendan and James Cusson, I think was his name, who wrote this kind of critique of metamodernism. That was had a lot of the periodization critiques in it. I guess I think, yeah, it's this whole problem, right, of people react. So anyway, his one of his critiques was that nobody in the meta-modern world uses postmodern, that it's used mostly pejoratively, and that it's kind of this view from the outside, and that you're not approaching postmodern like you would if you were from within postmodernism. And I think that's a good critique, but ultimately I just sort of I think the answer ends up being the same answer of the spectrum of being versus non-being, right? That as certain ideas have been latent, it's not like the idea of modernity didn't exist until 1700 or 1600s. That way of thinking came much earlier, but it was very latent, right? So you have this kind of spectrum of being that shows up in how these ideas get expressed in a cultural institution also. And so then anyway, we get into these issues again. This is where Richard and I've kind of disagreed a little bit, is if you're looking to kind of the oligarchs or the elites to define what artificial intelligence is, of course you're going to get something that is a view that is being filtered through that long institutional process, right? You're going to get an institutionally evolved view from a person like that. And so, that then becomes the kind of emic view from the inside, is these people who are the elites. But, so anyway, one of, I think, Brendan's answers to James was that the postmodernists may not even have thought of themselves as postmodern, right? Maybe I've heard you make this point too, Matt, that, they were making a critique of modernity that we call postmodernity, but to the degree that they really felt like that, was a view of their beliefs, is a whole other question.
Right.
Sorry, I went all over the place there probably, but
no, it's okay. It's so helpful to hear where each of you is coming from, and to just get a sense for the conversation that you two have been in for however long. It sounds like, Adam's the metamodernist, and Richard, you're more the traditionalist. I think I've certainly been in dialogue with a lot of metamodernists lately, but I'm in dialogue with a lot of traditionalists all the time too. And I don't know exactly where to place myself, because I don't want to just be observer independent from all of this debate. But
Right.
I guess I teach at an integral institute, and so there's the integral theory, and which is more than just Ken Wilber, but metamodernism is making a name for itself now, and so there's a lot happening. It's very exciting.
Ken Wilber. I couldn't do it.
Yeah, fair enough.
So complicated and heady.
That's for sure.
It's like, I got kids. I have to figure out how to have like a relationship with them on these issues. So to like be able to have a language where I can like engage with them on these most important issues, and to have, and this is something that Adam and I have talked about, but it's embodiment. We are embodied. And I mentioned like Gurdjieff and this idea of like empirical spirituality. When I first got interested in Gurdjieff, I was told, don't believe me, verify it for yourself. Don't take my word for it, verify it for yourself. You can verify it for yourself.
Right.
I've concluded belief comes before seeing. We see what we believe, we don't believe what we see. And obviously there's give and take there, but it's more
perception is an active
on
process.
the belief side, or what Vervaeke would call relevance realization.
Yeah.
No,
that's
so
the
for me,
that's
and this idea of like going back to Wolfgang's idea of vertical causation, right? Okay, so let's just talk about computable versus computational, right? So we can take, I was listening a little bit to Wolfram talking to Friston. You know? And Wolfram is the ultimate computational guy, right? He's got the Ruliad. And but you can never get to the computable from the computational. You can say that there's computational going on in some kind of fabric that we don't have access to. But in the end, all you ever can see, engage with, is the computable. Okay? So that there is a ontological gap between computational and computable. There is an ontological gap between classical and quantum mechanical, right? So there's an ontological gap between finite bit string and infinite bit string, or halting computer and non-halting computer. Like, these are ontological gaps. And you cannot bridge them and say that, you know, well, look, time and this horizontal kind of efficient causation is just doing something that we can't see in the quantum world, but you know, it's going to emerge out into the classical world where we can measure it and capture it and put it in a bottle and put some pins in it, you know. So that is, you know, that you cannot say that vertical causation, well, let me just say vertical causation is a reasonable response to that, that there is some kind of vertical causation there that cannot explain away, that cannot be explained by a purely horizontal efficient causation. And to me, that's undeniable at this point. I mean, I think even you agree with me on that, Adam. Am I, can you refute
Well, I
that?
think, yeah. So it's worth saying it just in one other set of language, right? That the
Sure.
computable versus computational is the same spectrum of being that I was already referring to, right?
Mm.
And so for something to be
Right.
computable would be like an infinity of being. Like you've gone to the infinite limit, like you talked about the quantum reference frame requiring an infinite bit string to describe, right? That's why it's not speakable. It's because it would take an infinite amount of information in order to describe it.
Which in the
But
end, we don't have, and we don't have
yeah,
access to it.
you don't
You
have it,
know?
but this is where I think you and I, again, this is where one of the points of disagreement is that that very act of measurement, you're just you're bringing back the measurer. It's the same thing you started off with, right? Like there's no observer independence.
I mean,
You're
I always
bringing
said
back the
about
early,
Wolfgang's work
you
was
bring
the measurer cannot be measured.
so you're bringing back what was these early quantum mechanics debates, and you're saying that now you're going back to like what some of the early guys thought of the measurer is having a causative impact on the system, right? And
Mhm.
not just like the physically measurable, not just the impact we can measure, the one that we can't measure also.
Yeah.
And so I guess in that spectrum of being, just to say that's where measurement becomes the point where you stop. Like you stop and you say, okay, we can't go to the limit of infinity, because that will take infinite amount of time and infinite energy. So we're just going to stop and we make a measurement. But that measurement is, again, in my thinking, it's not that that's not real. It's just that you've admitted that you have to stop this infinite process at some point and say, that's good enough, and now we take our measurement. And that has to be, and so that's, again, it's not saying that the system is not computational. That system is still computing. It's just not reaching that infinite limit of computability. So it never halts, right? Continues to try to run, finds an answer, so time goes on and the universe happens. That's kind of my line I say to Richard, right? Like, that this limit is you're not going to that infinite limit because the universe wouldn't run.
Mhm.
Yeah.
To me, that just, you can explain it as computational, but it's still an ontological gap. You can't
So
ever get there, right? So
yeah,
Well,
all I'm saying is that you can take that in a different way. To me, I take it as there is a measurer. There really is a measurer. And you can't sort of, rebind them in a new container and say, well, it's just the measurer measured, system, right? There's always a measurer.
I don't know, Matt, if
The
this may be what
person
you were
is
getting
always,
ready to say, but I started to say this earlier. That one of the things I heard you say that I was like, oh my gosh, is that you said that Whitehead, through a relational view, that he didn't view these quantum mysteries as being mysterious. And that's one of the things that's been so powerful for me with the relational view from Ravelli, is that the mystery of entanglement is no longer a mystery. It's that two things that are entangled, like their being is defined in relation to each other. And we're not interacting. We're trying very hard to not interact with that quantum system so we
Yeah.
don't disturb it. And
Yeah.
that means their being is not defined relative to us. It's only defined relative to each other. So anyway, the fact that I heard you say Whitehead demystified that, at the
Yeah.
same time it was happening, that was amazing to me.
Well, the problem is that we, at least intellectuals in the modern period, came to inhabit a toy model version of the universe that we thought it was mechanistic, and then
Yeah.
quantum physics showed that it couldn't possibly be like simply located particles banging into each other. Um, and it's like we had to rediscover through quantum physics what we should have already known experientially, that we live in a relational participatory universe. And so, yeah, Whitehead's um, cosmology would be allowing us to look again at our experience to see, oh, of course, we would discover something like uh, quantum physics, because all our experience overlaps. Our experience is imbued with possibility moment by moment. And the way Whitehead would describe the situation that in terms of what's measurable, what's computable versus the measurer. I mean, he talks about two kinds of analysis. What he calls coordinate analysis, which is what physics does. It measures things and it turns them into data streams, information. And that information is always going to be an approximation of what's really going on. It's always as if, because what it's doing is removing ourselves as observers from the system we're trying to measure, while also implicitly assuming that there's a perspective from which we could measure. And so rather than be naive about what science is doing, Whitehead develops an ontology where observers are part of the universe. Um, but there's a different kind of analysis when we shift over from what can be measured to the measurer, if you will. We need to do what he calls genetic analysis, because now we're talking about, like, for him, the process of concrescence, which is how each moment of experience actualizes itself. And concrescence takes place in this, you could call it a space of possibility, where there's nothing determinate yet that could be measured. There's a process unfolding where we're bringing infinitely many feelings from the past and from this realm of possibilities he calls the realm of eternal objects or Platonic forms. We're bringing conceptual feelings of those forms and physical feelings of the past, um, and we're coalescing them together and making a decision about uh, what would be the most intense form of experience that could be realized, right? And so, given this situation, but if we're gonna understand something like consciousness or experience or the person, we can't use Whitehead or Whiteheadian physicists like Timothy Eastman, for example, would distinguish between Boolean and non-Boolean forms of analysis, which is equivalent to Whitehead's coordinate analysis of the Boolean. In other words, the binary, that 1 or 0, like we can reduce it to some measurement in terms of its information content, versus the non-Boolean, which is what's going on inside of concrescence. It's an aesthetic process, not something that could be um, quantified and measured. And so we have to then, in this picture, understand physical science as always an approximation. So what can be computed is always going to be an approximation of what's going on. And we can use our models of what can be computed and measured to make predictions about the future. And as long as we assume that the general environment within which we're measuring and making predictions stays the same, then those scientific models will be accurate. But the thing is, we know in advance that the universe is going to continue to evolve. Those environmental conditions are going to change. And so none of our models, we should never fall into the mistake or the fallacy of imagining that one of our scientific models is the final answer, even if it's highly accurate. The universe will, the very laws of physics will continue to evolve in Whitehead's picture, because what's truly real is this process of concrescence, which is a process whereby novelty is produced moment by moment, right? And it's an immeasurable, infinite process. So that's one very small response to so many things that each of you said that I'd love to be able to loop back to and touch on. You know, if going back to this observer independence thing, Richard, your characterization of science as being observer independent, separating the observer from the observed, and the way in which religion for you seems to represent this more participatory way of relating to the universe. And you mentioned Fields pointing to the idea that the person is the ultimate quantum reference frame, and I think you're drawing some connection there that
The
if we're
measurer
gonna,
cannot be measured. That was like when I would do those talks with Wolfgang and Vervaeke and Pajot, and I even like I said in that conversation with Pajot, I said like Christ literally saves the world. It's that hypostatic idea, that union of that embodiment of the divine, and not trying to escape that embodiment, and not and recognizing that we can't apprehend everything. We
yeah,
are creatures, we are created, and to be, this is one thing that interests me, like if we want to elevate creativity, you know, why not have a creator be, the center of everything, right? Like,
yeah. Well,
why?
I think there's a way in which modern science and its observer independent view comes right out of medieval Catholic scholastic
Absolutely. I mean,
theology. It's
the
a
book I've
particular
been
image of
reading is
God as separate
called The
from the world.
13th, the Greatest of Centuries. It's
Mhm.
it's on my bookshelf right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Thomas Aquinas is the great synthetic integrative thinker who brings Aristotelian science and Christian theology into a really beautiful
Yeah.
system.
Yeah.
Um, and I think we still have a lot to learn from Aquinas, and
Yeah.
he has a whole conception of epistemology that's embodied and participatory that I think we can still learn so much from. But
Me
but
too.
there's Aquinas is yeah, is deep and rich, but a a broader conception coming out of medieval theology of an all-powerful God that is separate from the universe and created the universe in a rational way. And all the
Hmm.
modern scientists in the 17th century assumed this view. And it's a kind of deism. And it's really the
Hmm.
only
Yeah.
reason that they would even have this seemingly absurd idea that like
Yeah.
nature obeys these laws, these precise mathematical laws that we as human beings can decode,
Yeah.
right? Because the creator of our soul and the creator of this, you know, rational law-abiding world is the same creator.
Yeah.
That's the fundamental ontotheological and epistemological basis of modern science.
I agree. Yeah.
A few centuries later, that background, the theological background of modern science gets forgotten and
Yeah.
elided, and
Yeah.
so science rests on some kind of absurd foundation, like, well, we don't know why the universe is intelligible. We don't know why we're intelligent, but here we are. Let's do science.
Yeah.
But I think to there's a way in which this participatory view that I hear you speaking to,
Mhm.
um, we can apply it in science as well. But to apply it in science, we have to also apply it in theology first. And a more participatory theology, I think, has a lot to do with understanding the incarnation,
Mhm. Yeah.
where you can think of a creator God as the author of the cosmic novel, and we're you know characters in that novel as human
Mhm.
beings.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
and theologians are trying to be like not just characters but readers of the story, and philosophers too. Like we want to step back a little bit out of our just self-interest as characters within the story and see the story as a whole. Doesn't
Mm-hmm.
make us the creator of the story, but we're at least a reader and not just a character in it.
Mm-hmm.
But
Nice.
what happens with the incarnation is like the author of the story all of a sudden decides to become one of the characters in the story. Not just a
Yeah.
character,
Yeah.
but it's like some integration of the author and the character.
Totally.
And all of
Totally.
a sudden, like one of the characters in the story is talking to the other characters, like, "Hey, I wrote all this," and
Yeah.
so, but that's a fundamental transformation in the nature of the divine,
Yeah.
which also fundamentally transforms the creation.
Totally.
And I think God's no longer a creator anymore, or at least not just a creator.
Mm-hmm.
God has become a creature
Mm-hmm.
also, not
Yes.
instead of, but also.
Yeah. Beautiful.
And it also makes the human being into more than just a creature as well,
Yes.
right?
Absolutely.
Um, and so, when I think about like you mentioned wanting to reconnect with a kind of pre-Cartesian understanding
Mm-hmm.
of the human being, and I certainly would agree that we need to move beyond the Cartesian view, but I wonder if there might be some difference between trying to undo it and return to a time before Descartes versus trying to go through Descartes to some other transformed way of being.
So I think that these truths that you're speaking of have always been present
Hmm,
in the Catholic mystical tradition.
sure.
And I think that the
Meister
Catholic
Eckhart, for
mystical
sure, right?
Meister Eckhart, and Wolfgang would always say, Peter killed John.
Hmm,
The institutional,
yeah.
external facing, embodied church killed the spirit as represented by John, St. John, right? And I
Yeah.
know we can all nod our heads and go, yeah, yeah, that's right. you know, and, and, but there's something, so like I actually want our world to work, I don't want to abandon it. Um, and I think that actually, if we look at the history of the Catholic Church, it's the longest forming, existing form of government in Western civilization. And um, and there's something to its recognition that we are embodied. There has to be a church. There has to be a nominal head of the church, the Pope, right? And everybody's like, "Oh, the Pope? No way! I'm never going to bow down to the Pope. I'll never be obedient to the Pope." Well, you know what? That constraint is very, very, very small. And um, I say like the Eucharist um, is the minimal obeisance, the minimal recognition, the most minimal conceivable recognition that there is some kind of inescapable top-down dimension, to our experience, our relationships. There is something, there's always going to be top-down in our lives, right? And I think because we pretend that everything's bottom up now, we actually subject ourselves to all of these top-down narratives that we don't realize we're being subject to because we think it's all bottom up, but collectively, socially, we have to have some level of agreed upon top-downness in order to have any kind of um, society, and we've lost that now. We've
Yeah.
lost that, and how do we recover that, right? And science isn't going to recover it for us, like I don't care how you build out the third version of the internet, it's not going to do it. It's not going to solve our problems. And I think that that wisdom tradition is in those, it's in Augustine, it's in Aquinas, it's in Francis and Dominic and that effort to say, you know what, we got to deal with both quality and quantity. And I think that the church the church does that. And it does it in a way that, you know what, you don't have to be super smart to um, to be recognized as valuable in it, you know? Like that's something that's so important, you know? I mean, we're such smart asses. We're such smart asses, you know? And we think because we're smart or because we went to some fancy school that we're better than everybody else. At least that's how I used to see it, you know? And that like it really troubles me now. And I love how I can be in a church community and there's really no questions about like who does what and where'd you come from and you know what is your status or what's your IQ or how good are you with language, you know? No, it's like there's this wonderful equality that I've never experienced anywhere else. And I don't know how we get back to that because this world trajectory that we're on is like, you know, the divide is just getting worse and worse and worse because you can only wield the tools of technology if you have a certain level of, education and intellectual ability. And it doesn't make everybody equal. And there's always going to be, you know, kings who are ultimately determining what the words and the narratives are that get out there that ultimately entangle the quantum reference frames of the people, right? Everybody is a quantum reference frame. We all are approaching entanglement asymptotically to some kind of narrative. And so for me, that, like I've said, yep, that's how it works. You know, there's non-commutativity of quantum reference frames. Okay. We're bound to communicate classically. I'm going to be entangled with something. I'm going to choose what I'm going to be entangled with. And I have that choice. I get to make that choice. Right. And science can't tell me that I can't choose something that it doesn't endorse or approve of. And science is like, I love science, you know, I really do. I want to save science. I think science is bankrupting itself because of its idea that it can somehow explain everything when it can't. Science is best practiced in wonder. Science is best practiced, like in a sense that you're like, oh, look at this. It's so beautiful. It's incomprehensible. Wow, you know? And so meanwhile, um, so I just think that we need some kind of um, embodied institutions that do, um, give us a minimal amount of common entanglement.
Yeah.
And I don't know
Yeah.
where we get that right now. I mean, for me, I'm getting it from not like, look, I go to, it's like two old monks, who, and maybe 30 people, but there's something called the Catholic land movement that I've started to get involved with and that is arising and kind of growing out of it originated back in England in the early 20th century in response to the industrialism and the problems of industrialism. You see that today with like homesteading and the interest in homesteading that is arising, and then kind of connecting that back to how do we kind of establish a lifestyle that's more in like uh, rhythm with creation itself.
Yeah.
And so those are all things to me that I just, and then there's this idea like the Gurdjieff and the Theosophists and the Steiners, et cetera, right? That I just, again, it's like, it's just, it's too smart.
Mm.
It's too smart. It's like you got to be too smart to understand it all and be in the club, you know? It used to be a joke. I'm sure it's true of all religions, but in the Gurdjieff world, it's like, you know, somebody gets in the gates of heaven, you know, and they're like St. Peter showing them around, like, oh, who's behind that door? Oh, well, you know, be quiet as we walk by this door, right? How come? Like, oh, well, the Gurdjieffians are in there and they think they're the only ones here.
Yeah,
So,
that's a fair critique. Yeah. Um, I think for me, I feel like there's this yeah, there's this real truth in what you're saying, and the way that modern individualism and the emphasis on values of, democracy and this secular sense of being freed from what became considered to be a kind of suffocating sacredness. The individual
right.
wanted to discover their own sense of values, and that starts initially with Protestantism, but then it just leaves religion behind entirely and becomes more about the self. And there's so many ways in which what modern science did is take this observer independent God's eye view that's God's and
Mhm.
appropriate it for the human being to say, oh, no, now we are the observer independent,
Right.
uh, you know, prospectors of the universe. And modern individualism is in some sense the deification of the ego, of the self.
Right.
And I think, but at the same time, individual freedom, these democratic values, are essential for a pluralistic world. And I mean, the Catholic Church is huge. Billion Catholics, is
Oh,
that
yeah.
some?
And quite diverse.
And it's quite diverse. And so
Quite
it's
diverse.
universal in the sense that it includes um, these cultural differences
Yeah.
um, within it,
Different
and ethnic.
energies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's real potential there. And I think, but
Yeah.
there's even more diversity than that. I mean, there's so many non-theistic traditions, and
Mhm.
there's the Islamic world, and so, one of the things you mentioned, uh, Rudolf Steiner, and I see him at anthroposophy as an example of trying to preserve the sense of communal bonds, and like that we really are members of the body of God. Um, at the same time that we allow for there to be many different ways for um, different human communities to perform that communion and maintain that communion, and that we can. I don't know if this would be your view necessarily, Richard, but when it comes to the laws that govern our political relationships, I think the founders of the United States were quite wise in saying, like, those should be determined in as secular a way as we can. And we're going to, of course, need the church communities to give us a sense of deep values and um, morality and whatnot. Like the state can't provide that, but the state shouldn't arrive at its laws based on any particular religious um, viewpoint, because we
Yeah.
have multiple
Look at where
religions.
we are
So,
now, right? We have no moral compass anymore.
well, we have capitalism, um,
That's
which
not a
is,
moral compass.
well, it's become our moral compass,
I know.
right?
And
Um,
I think we should all be troubled by that.
I do too. It's individualism without any kind of sacred backdrop, or at
Absolutely.
least the sacred has been replaced with
And it's the
wealth.
elevating of capital above everything else. I mean, it's
Yeah.
in the
And so
word
Catholic social teaching, I
capitalism,
think
right?
Catholic social teaching is so important
It is.
right now. And I
It is.
also, I don't know, I wonder how you feel about Pope Francis, but what he's done to speak to the ecological relevance of a biblical worldview, I think,
Yeah.
and giving new interpretation to what environmental ethicists and philosophers and theologians have always, eco-theologians at least, have critiqued, is
Yeah.
the dominion clause in Genesis that just gives human beings the right to, seemingly, some would say, do whatever we want with creation,
Right.
instead of being, tasked by God with maintaining its vitality and goodness,
Yeah.
and
I
I
find
stewards,
thought just
not
giving
owners.
Unitarians.
names. I thought all that meant was giving the names.
Hmm.
Wasn't that
Yeah,
enough dominion?
right. So,
I
but I
hear this
wonder what you think
critique
of Pope
of the
Francis,
church
though.
as being somehow insensitive to the ecology, right? Like we don't, this isn't our permanent home, you know, we know like we're going to ultimately be somewhere else. So it's okay if we mess it up, you know, but that, I think the technologists have done way more to mess it up. And they're the ones that are actually like trying to frame the church as somehow being responsible for being uncaring about creation,
Hmm.
you
Sure.
know, where it's like it's a ridiculous argument because
Well, it's especially so
it's the
after the
technologists and the
Laudato Si.
capitalists who, you know, have us on the precipice of some pretty awful things, and those never were issues back when the church was in charge.
Hmm.
Um, and look, I'm not imagining that we're going to go back to some kind of medieval theocracy. Um, but I do think that we're making a mistake when we throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Mm.
And I think, you know, Wolfgang was often characterized as a perennialist, right? But he was not a perennialist.
Oh, he's
He was
Catholic.
a
Yeah.
Catholic.
Yeah.
And he wrote that last book, Christian Wisdom. What is it? Uh, I don't have it here right in front of me, but it's Vedic. It was on Christianity and Vedic
Mhm.
traditions, right?
Mhm.
And because he'd spent time in India, right? Um, and I didn't go to India, but I spent time in the Hindu tradition myself, back in Berkeley, actually. And so I think there's a danger, again, in that perennialist perspective that, again, it's like observer independent religion, let's call it,
Yeah, right.
you
Right.
know, but you're not, okay, look, like I think that the Catholic religion is the most amazing, profound thing that's meeting so many of my needs and my family's needs and solving all kinds of problems for me. And I think everybody should, I want to share that joy with everyone, you
Mm.
know, and I think it's a wonderful response to uh, the quantum enigmas. But I'm not going to say like everybody needs to be Catholic, right? And like I want to force everybody to be Catholic. Like that's you can't do that. But the
Mm.
church doesn't do that, you
Yeah.
know.
Well,
So
I won't I've certainly been searching for like an institutional home, a
yeah,
church, and
it was
I've
did you ever come across uh Seraphim Rose, the Orthodox guy
I
who was in
saw
Berkeley?
a
He
friend of
wrote
mine mentioned his work. I haven't gotten
So
around
he
to it
was
yet,
a
but
linguist at Berkeley, you know, student with Alan Watts back in the 60s,
right.
brilliant guy. And he walked into the Orthodox Church one day and was brought to his knees and he became an Orthodox monk. And he wrote a book,
Right.
a bit short book called Nihilism, The
Mm.
Roots of the Modern Revolution.
Yeah.
That was a big influence on me. That was one of the first books that sort of made me go, what? Maybe like I grew up Lutheran, you know, and like I was gone from the Lutheran church by the time I was 14, you know, hormones hit and I'm living in LA and I'm out of there.
Yeah.
And um but Seraphim Rose like really
You're the second person in the span
he's a
of
modern
two
he's a modern
weeks
guy, you
to
know.
mention.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, it's amazing. Amazing work. Really
Mm.
amazing. You know, and what he said is you have to crucify the mind to the what he would say the church fathers, the patristic fathers, right? But it is so I think we can begin to understand that as a um, to me like these quantum insights really are metaphors that help me to understand that we get to choose what to entangle ourselves with, you know? And so uh, to me, like Catholicism is asymptotic entanglement with Jesus Christ. And he's the greatest historical figure that I can conceive of. And so if I want to like align my life with that and be Christ-like, then I have to engage with the narratives that are going to ultimately lead me to entanglement with that being.
Mhm.
And so then you start to see the practices of the church as actually being conduits for that entanglement.
Mhm.
And you might say, well, you know, it's
Right.
I don't want to be entangled with anyone, you know, I'm going to be a free agent.
I mean,
You
I would
can,
say
no,
there's
but
something compelling about the enduring vitality of the church after all of these centuries. But also, what so speaks to me about the Christ event is how that entanglement actually spills out beyond any institutional walls.
yeah,
And
totally.
so there is no human
Well, Christ
institution,
cannot be contained in an institution, no doubt
right?
about it, you know.
And so
It's
there
just
are
us humans that need an institution.
yeah, and I ran from church life, from
Yeah,
my mom's way of relating to the Bible as a teenager, and became a Buddhist, and yeah, really turned east and got into Alan Watts and
me too.
DT Suzuki and all of that, and then I had an experience of Christ that that changed me. It didn't bring me to a church, but it did bring me to the Christ within myself and within others.
Hmm.
And yeah, I've sought for an institutional home. I haven't found one. I mean, within Christianity proper, Catholic, Episcopal,
Yeah,
Unitarian, even, which the
yeah,
closest there, but that's so watered down. It's like, I don't even know.
yeah.
But anthroposophy, I went to the Goetheanum and was hoping to find something there in Dornach, Switzerland. And it's, for me, it was too religious too, in the sense of there are certain dogmatisms that have taken root even in this organization, this anthroposophical society that
Hmm.
was founded by someone who said, this is a science, don't take my word for it. Practice, see what you can see. But inevitably, he saw so much that was so compelling, everybody just repeats what he said.
Yeah.
um, and
Steiner was amazing. I mean, he was truly
yeah, so I haven't
off
I
the
haven't found a
charts.
place that I can call home yet, other than just
Yeah,
the wilds of, human interaction more broadly. And if I
yeah.
were, I think the closest thing I have to church right now is a group that I meet with every Friday morning,
Hmm.
to talk about the human condition and our relationship to the divine. And um, I wish I did it in person. It's on Zoom, but people all over the world. But I think ideally, a one way to revitalize this connection to the spirit, like to the Holy Spirit, would be to just have, you know, cathedral. I mean, sacred architecture is so important for getting you in the mood to commune. But I
Yeah.
think we can also have church in someone's living room, with tea and just talking to each other about how our personal problems relate to uh, the deeper spiritual source of things, um, and just
I have
trust that
found there's something really amazing in the practice,
mm,
in the religious practice. And
the
it is
the liturgy and the ritual
the liturgy is, I'm reading one of my favorites. There's a book called the Liturgical Year. It's actually 15 books. It's written by a Benedictine monk, French Benedictine monk in the late 1800s. And he's credited with restoring Catholicism to France after the French Revolution. So he's writing the liturgical year, and like taking the liturgy, of what is, which is a cyclical thing, right? Um, and just, and commenting on the hyper rationalism of the French Revolution and of that time in general, right? And there's so much metaphor in there. There's so much, we are the words that we take in. We really are.
Mm.
And meanwhile, without so to me, it's like, okay, I could spend that time on that, or I could come over to my computer and I could sort of bop around to 15 different things and and then like a couple hours later be like, what just happened to me?
Yeah.
And our whole consumer society wants that level of indecisiveness. It thrives on it, right?
Right.
As opposed to a conscious engagement and participation with a tradition.
Yeah.
And
It's much easier to be a spiritual window shopper than to make
it
a
is,
commitment.
it is SBNR, buddy, baby. Spiritual, but not religious, right? And yeah. So anyway, I mean, it's
Richard, can I
yeah,
jump
please,
in?
Adam. Sorry, I'm talking
Sort
so
of-
much.
Oh, no, you're fine. You're fine. I just want to connect a few dots, I guess. I think, one thing that Richard and a group that Richard and I are part of have talked about a lot is scale, right? And I mentioned, I talked about latency of ideas and I talked about institutional expression of those ideas, as they've evolved. I sort of wonder, like when it's back to being inside something or outside, right? And I think this is something I realized deeply when you and I were conversing a couple weeks ago, Richard, that
Hmm.
when you make that choice to go into something and view it from the inside,
Yeah.
you become willing to kind of set aside a lot of those evolved institutional issues, right? Whereas when you're viewing something from the outside, you tend to see those as the deal breakers. And
Yeah.
I think that you do that about science,
Mhm.
like because kind of what I said about quantum gravity, right? Like there are these kind of ideas that are more latent and not really expressed in the culture or in the institutions within science that I think are compatible with all the things we're talking about. But you don't see those if you just look at kind of how the institution expresses, has come to express, what it believes. So there's almost something about truth, like I almost think there's something about our deepest truths that will always be latent. In the sense that as a culture evolves or an institution evolves to express what maybe used to be something that had a lot of truth, it loses that truth, right? So like the same idea expressed through an institution doesn't have the same amount of truth as the idea when it was coming from the people who started it, when it was more latent. So anyway,
Yeah,
that brings me to scale. Go ahead, Richard. What was your thought?
I just want to challenge you on that just a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
in that if you look at our dialogue about, science and Catholicism, I think you'd probably agree that I've gone a lot deeper into science than you have into Catholicism.
Well, that's true of Catholicism, but I grew up, as Protestant as you can be. So
I know, but so you can't it's not the same. I am not institutionally rejecting science.
uh,
In fact, I've appreciated and asked you for many clarifications and many questions to try to understand things better, as of you as a physicist to help me understand this. And I've, deeply benefited from those things.
but yet, despite the truth that there might be in some of those statements, what's become of institutionalized science does need to go away, right?
Yeah.
Uh, yeah,
Yeah,
so
for
sort of
sure.
a paradox. So I guess
So
what
back
I
to
wanted to
scale.
mention with the scale thing, or what I really wanted to get to, was another thing I'm big on, which is tools. And I think another thing that, like, it's funny, the periodization that the meta-modernists talk about usually has technological progress kind of at the root of the periodization or the epochs. And I think that's so right and so important, right? Because that's the novelty, like in the sense
Mm.
of human, like it's not human nature that becomes novel, or at least not obviously, but technological progress introduces true novelty. And then, you know, these ideas in our institutions evolve with that novelty in place. So that's where I think, again, the periodization, if and when you tie it to technology, it makes a lot of sense to me. Like certain things are not going to, you know, and it's a McLuhan kind of thing, right? It's the medium of communication that the technology really represents. That's what really matters. And so the medium of communication, you know, when that changes foundationally, of course you're going to get these big paradigmatic shifts. All that to say that the technology and the tools, I think, become so important. And I do, like, while I understand what you were saying there and your criticism of technology, that it becomes this big waste of time and attention, I think that's absolutely right. But I see these same tools that we're developing as the first time we have a chance to even think about how to address these issues of scale. And you know, I think the Steiner and the beloved community thing, like, this is what I've been thinking about a lot, is like, what are the tools that you would need to have in place to maintain a community as a beloved community? So like one of them I mentioned yesterday in some text, Richard, was, you know, an LLM analysis of the language that's being used by community members, and using that as a tool to recognize when you get these, the issue with, you know, how communities see the kind of stage models like the MHC or the spiral, you know, spiral dynamics, right? In a community that so quickly becomes this like yardstick of who's better than other people, right? Like, oh, I've progressed to this level, and no, you're not understanding what I'm saying because you're still at this level below me. You should be able to see that in, you know, what Ben's calling the semantic signatures of a community's writing. And that's the kind of tool that's never existed before. And I think using those kind of tools to be like, you know, both to like help guide communities, not just in the practices and the things that I totally think you're right are like very inherently valuable and very foundational and that we've lost, but also like, how do you not let those evolve into the kind of cultural issues that I was mentioning at the beginning, right? Like that's the tool that we've not had in the past.
Yeah. Technological evolution and the shift in media communication technologies, I think, is so important. And McLuhan, a Catholic, by the way.
Was he Catholic? Not
Oh,
surprised.
oh, oh, yeah. Was so hip to this. I mean, what really was the first major challenge to the power of the Catholic Church? The printing press.
Printing press.
Um, which you couldn't have had the Protestant, you know, Reformation without that, to translate the Bible out of Latin into the vernaculars. And I think similarly, radio, it's not that radio caused fascism, but without the radio, you can't have the Führer. Like the Nazi Party, as soon as they took power, they manufactured this radio that they made sure was in everyone's living room so that like Hitler could communicate directly and they could have this mystical communion with their leader. Similarly, with the television and these images coming back from Vietnam, like the anti-war movement, I think was catalyzed, not caused. I'm not, this isn't reductionistic, but to see these images being backed into people's living rooms of the carnage going on, I think did inspire the anti-war movement. We all know and love and hate what social media has done to our politics and to our discourse. But there are real transformations in the very basis of and the very phenomenological structure of human consciousness that results from the adoption, the widespread adoption of these technologies. And it, you know, the alphabet, I think, is so important for there to even be a Bible, and for these stories to be written down and for the Bible to become a great code for the construction of a certain kind of civilization. This all rests on this communication technology. The alphabet was originally invented, though, for economic reasons by the Phoenicians. and then gets adapted for these other purposes. And to go from the alphabet to the printing press to the telegraph to the radio to the television to the internet, these are epical shifts in maybe not human nature so much, but definitely in reshaping the structure of human consciousness
The relationships.
and our relationships to one another. And, McLuhan, I think, speaks to this in a way that makes it very relevant to what we might mean by the mystical body of Christ. He saw the internet coming and what electronic media would do to our culture.
It's
And
Steiner.
as did Steiner, Teilhard de Chardin as well, another Catholic who I know Wolfgang was not too keen on. Um, but there's ways of understanding this technological evolution as I would almost describe it as a kind of, you could say it's like the gradual incarnation of the Logos, transforming the physical world into a more fluid medium for the conveyance uh, of spirit. And this gets really esoteric, but I think the story of the serpent in the garden is in some sense the story of the role that technology plays in human life.
And
Um,
the tree of knowledge versus the tree of life,
right. But the thing is,
right?
how, I mean, how do we read that story of the Garden of Eden and Eve being tempted by the serpent and eating the apple? Um, I think, can we really say that an all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing God wouldn't have kind of needed or wanted or somehow foreseen that we were going to eat that apple? And so this journey of technological evolution, co-evolution between
Mhm.
humans and technology, I think is part of the sacred history that um, we cannot but participate in. And so we can't just reject technology. I mean, there's much that we must resist in the temptation that it breeds in us to become distracted from the task, the sacred task.
I
But I
mean,
think
we
the
can
tools
set
are
it
here to
aside.
help
We
us.
can choose not to participate in it. It is a
No,
valid
no, we
choice.
can't. No, we can't. Where do we go? How do we do that? I mean,
People have done it. They go to the desert. There's the
Ted
Amish,
Kaczynski, you mean, or like
like
what?
no, I don't mean Ted Kaczynski.
That's the embodied thing, right?
The
I mean,
Amish,
you
The
have to
you can
Amish,
become,
certainly reduce the role of technology in your life.
for sure. Yeah, yeah.
Um, so
I
we
think
do
though
have
there's
some
something.
choice over it, but yeah, there is an evolutionary history of it, and fully engaged with it. I'm building AI.
And you got Wolfgang online, and what a
I got
boon that
Wolfgang
is.
online and absolutely. So and here I am, So I think it's great, but I don't my PhD is in system science. I study the complexity sciences. I spent time at the Santa Fe Institute. I worked in the field of artificial life, trying to produce emergent properties out of, competing agents in computers. And I studied Teilhard, who was like one of the only Catholics that actually made it into the that field, right? Because he's talking about evolution, right? We've lived and breathed this idea of evolution for so long, that we just can't think without it anymore. And I agree with Wolfgang that evolution is actually a religious um, idea, right? That's necessitated out of our efficient causation and horizontal causality. And
Yeah, and again, I think he had too narrow a conception of evolution to reduce it to just that, because that's not Teilhard's view of evolution. That's not Brian Swim or Thomas Berry's view of evolution. But it
Mhm.
is religious. It is an evolutionary spirituality.
Yeah, and
But
it's
I
not
think it's
something
like,
that you can prove, right? It's not a
no,
scientific proven fact.
no. But I would want, it's like instead of having to choose between creationism and evolution, I would want a creative evolution. Like we can
Yes.
have an integration of these perspectives and
Yeah.
grant that there's something in, but there's evolutionary theory is a theology. And so, but it's
It
like
is a
somewhere
theology.
between science and religion, right?
Mhm.
And I think we really need to seek these integrative points of view. And like rather than just saying science will always be observer independent, can we have a participatory science? Can we have a science that recognizes that human personhood is at the base of is the epistemological and ontological presupposition of science, that it's like we can do science because of the nature of human personhood, and that human personhood isn't just something we might explain scientifically. No, no. We explain science because there's human personhood. I would put it that way. But rather than having science and religion be at odds with each other, or evolution and a view of the universe or creation as being somehow divinely inspired, like I really think our task is to integrate these things. And I think Teilhard goes a long way towards doing that. I have problems with Teilhard too, um, but I don't know that it's helpful. I mean, one of the things that I really found, I'll say, and disappointing about Wolfgang's view is that he would say that Teilhard was possessed by evil. Like he literally said that, and
Mhm.
I find that yeah, unfortunate and short-sighted, because for me, the what would bring me back to taking um, the Catholic vision of things seriously would be someone like Teilhard, or his influence. His influences like Thomas Berry. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Thomas Berry. He was a
Mhm.
Catholic
Yeah.
passionist monk and philosopher.
Mhm.
Um,
Thomas
that would
Merton.
that's what would bring me back. Would be that kind of integration.
I think
Um,
there is that room in the church. There really
mhm.
is. Those people
Yeah,
are in the church. Talk
right.
about a diverse
For sure. Yeah.
body, institution, and collection of people. I definitely. So just going back for a minute to like my core concerns, right?
Yeah.
So, um, like I think that through this kind of left brain, observer independent, analytical Cartesian framework that we've been operating in, like do we agree about that? That's been
I think
going
so.
on for 500-600 years, right? And probably grew out of the church, right? Probably grew out of that medieval scholasticism. And this book, The 13th, The Greatest of Centuries, is really fascinating
Mm.
just to learn that history, that the universities were created in the 13th century, right? Almost exactly like they are today. And but I think that perspective has led us to a very um, uh, like destructive and uncaring and um, uh, mentally ill society where we're not really connected with each other. So I appreciate the ideas of relationalism, right? And yet, it all seems to me in a way to actually, it's sort of like the if we think of a limit in the mathematical sense, like an infinite limit, right? Something approaches something asymptotically. And so the idea of like these science-based explanations of reality and of the universe, which ultimately become like a cosmology and a theology, really kind of permit and perpetuate um, this disconnected um, framework that we're operating in today. You know, capitalism, scale, And I'm really looking for a way out of that, you know? And I'm
Richard,
looking for a way out of it, not just for me. I'm definitely looking for a way out of it for me, but I'm looking for a way out of it for us collectively too, because I do think that we are, I mean, I'm in the financial industry, and it's a terrible, finance is a terrible business. Finance is a terrible like disease that has like just taken over our world, and to treat everything as fungible and as financial. Web3, this idea is like that we're all going to actually be financial. you know, we're all going to be digitized, and we're all going to be, bartering our identities and our creations, on a continuous basis. So there's something really broken in the model. And I know, Matt, you're trying to get at that. And I know, Adam, you are too. I have found like these, it's like, okay, well, what do we do? You know? And then I go to church, and it's like, it is a beautiful community, and it's there. And there's a young boy who's a um, quadriplegic, can't communicate with anyone, often is like crying out during the services, but he's a child of God. He's my equal, he's my peer. I'm glad he's there, you know? And I don't know how to get back to that. How do we get back to that as a society where we put the person first? And to me, that's what the church does. That's what Christianity does. It puts the person first. And so to have this idea that computers are going to be sentient somehow is so dehumanizing and so um, permissive of a right for us to just abuse one another and to abuse creation itself. So I don't know how to solve those problems. Well, I mean, I can say my resolution of them at this moment in time in my life is in the church. And I found that to be very meaningful and very effective. So, and very democratic.
Hmm. Hmm.
so Richard, I guess, one of the, so I think the relational bias that gets set up when you take this view, we've already mentioned it several times, right? Is
Yeah.
that novelty, the kind of way that the universe naturally generates novelty means a certain openness to new things, I think, that makes it hard to look back in the way that you're talking about. And I curious to hear Matt, not to put it into his, put it on him, but I suspect this looking for a sort of institutional home, I have the sense that I'm waiting for something new. And I think the issue with the idea that I could adopt Catholicism, at least one of my issues, is that were I to say I was adopting a form of that has a lot of these like earlier, more heretical or latent ideas that have been kind of evolved out of the core institution or the mainstream version of the institution, isn't it still something new then on the other side?
I
So
think it
like
is
in the
something
end, if
new.
I'm going to end up with something new anyway, then it's kind of like I haven't actually gone back. So anyway, that's another paradox that I don't know the right answer to, but I know I feel like
Yeah.
in that I'm kind of waiting to see what that new thing is, but never finding it.
Well, I mean, Thomas Aquinas was almost put on, or maybe one of his books was put on the index initially, right? And
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
there's a way in which the church has,
Eckhart, of course,
yeah, yeah, yeah. And there are ideas in the church fathers like Origen about like
Oh,
reincarnation and apokatastasis, if I'm pronouncing that right. Everyone is saved in the end, even Satan, that
Yeah.
yeah,
didn't become part of, the Catholic doctrine, but that I really find
yeah,
really important ideas. And so,
yeah,
but a process relational worldview and philosophy does bias us towards novelty. But the thing about novelty is it's always renovation. It's never just creation from nothing.
Mm.
So you're working with the material at hand, you're working with what you inherit. But the thing is, whatever we inherit it's never going to be the same twice because we're always interpreting it from an ever renewed present. And so I would expect that the Catholic Church will continue to evolve, and
It
that
always is evolving.
Christianity, yeah,
Yeah.
that Christianity will continue to evolve. And there's something, and he's not the only one that says this, but something that Steiner says that I really take to heart, which is that we're only just beginning to see the historical impact of the Christ event. Yeah, it's been 2,000 years, but it's just beginning. This is an epical transformation in the nature of the human being that will continue to unfold for thousands of years. Um, and so, what institutional forms end up supporting that ongoing process remains to be seen. I mean, and the Catholic Church has it's anti-fragile, to use Nicholas Taleb's term, and so I would expect it'll probably continue to hang around, but it'll change.
Yeah.
And other forms of relationship to Christianity that might not even go under that banner will emerge. And I think I want to be open enough to the spirit of this event and this transformation that I would be able to recognize it, even if it were called something else by the communities that were engaged in it, and so um, know them by their fruits, right? Uh, and so we have to remain, I think, sensitive enough to this this being that Christians call Christ, borrowing a Greek translation of a Hebrew term, that we want to be universal. And so if we really want it to be universal, we have to be less attached to the names we give it. Um, I'm not a nominalist, right? But I also think when we're dealing with human cultural diversity, like sometimes we translate things differently. And interreligious dialogue is an inevitable part of the future of religion, as far as I'm concerned, which means being able to find ways of maintaining a commitment to a faith that's unique and specific and personal, while also always remaining open to the otherness of those who find a home elsewhere, right? And there's a subtle ethos and I think almost meta faith that one must presuppose for that to even be possible. And we can't speak to what exactly that is because it's not, I might be able to learn something from a Buddhist and a Buddhist might be able to learn something from me, but um, we can't ever characterize what it is that binds us together other than just to say that we're committed to an openness to the other, so I think that's what I'm calling inter-religious dialogue. And it feels to me like I wouldn't be comfortable just calling myself a follower of Christ unless I were also committed to that kind of pluralism, because uh, I I resist the mm, I'm not I don't want to just say there are many paths to the top of the mountain, that old perennialist trope. Um, a teacher of mine and a colleague, Jorge Ferrer, talks about an ocean with many shores. There's a different kind of metaphor for getting at what this spiritual mystery is that binds different traditions together. Um, but yeah, it's a tension I try to hold, right, between the particularity of my commitment to a historical event and the being who did that deed, while also remaining open to learning from those for whom spirit, for lack of a better word, uh, is described differently, right? Um, I can't seem to find a way out of that tension.
I would just invite us to consider in anything that we've done in this life that we feel like we are like becoming better at it. There's usually some kind of organization there. So we all, we went to college, right? We were educated. We went through a process. We went through an institution. I spent 20 years in Gurdjieff groups. These things all form us, and we are embodied, and we have organized democracy. We have elections, and there's a risk if we just say we're just being open and waiting for something new, that we don't go deeper into that history of other minds like us who were wrestling and are wrestling with these same human realities. That's what I think the risk is. And really, I mean, I've just been amazed. I'm really, and I'm sure it sounds like I'm trying to like convert you guys or something, but I'm really just sharing where I'm at in my experience. Like the Catholic Church is the last place I thought I would end up in my life. Truly, the last place. And now I look at it and I'm like, why was this hidden from me for so long? Like, why was none of this ever shared with me? Because the richness of the history there of human beings, just like the three of us, wrestling with these issues and doing it through history with a thread that started with Christ and the apostles, is really an amazingly rich, deep vein that now that I'm like, mining it, is like, I can't believe it. And there's just a lot there.
I don't know if we're trying to climb back up rather than dig deeper down at this
Yeah,
point, but
I got to start cooking dinner here soon.
I'd
Yeah, I
love
need
to
to run
just
in a
hear
few minutes
Matt.
too.
But
I'd love to hear you, Matt, quick talk about this term I just very recently saw you use, which I think is chaos megenesis, essentially.
Chaosmogenesis. Oh yeah.
Yeah, and I think you talked about the Adam and Eve story and the serpent, right? I guess one of the things I think is interesting, Richard, is Matt also kind of alluded earlier to, right, how science grows out of the church. So anyway, the chaos part of that, I'm pretty interested because you talked about the source of novelty earlier, right? And I suspect that the source of novelty is tied up in this term. So anyway, I'm pretty interested in the idea, and I haven't wrapped my head around it yet, but I'm pretty interested in the idea that thinking about Christ as being the start of that story, Richard, is a mistake, and that and that the story is really kind of about chaos and order, and that Matt, I think, I don't remember who you were talking to, but use this great term of the Christ impulse. I really think it's fascinating, that moment or that impulse and what that did to a story that was already being told. Anyway,
Yeah. I think of Christ as often playing this mediating role between order and chaos, because you might think, oh, well, Christ is in favor of order, but in his time, he was really upsetting the Pharisees and the way that the law was being interpreted and the way that the money changers were in the. I mean, he was upsetting those who had established the order in Jerusalem. You know, so he's not simply coming to restore order to a chaotic society, or and so,
Right.
but to take a step back and look at the way that chaos has been coded, not just by biblical or Abrahamic faiths as evil. But even I think by uh, modern secular political and scientific orientations, chaos is bad. You know, we want to know the laws of physics. We want an ordered society.
Yeah.
And so there's this fear around unleashing this dark, unpredictable um, energy. And I think what process relational thought allows us to do, and this is, you know, Whitehead's understanding, is first of all, there's no such thing as pure chaos, just as there's no such thing as pure order. Um, and instead of coding chaos as evil, we can code chaos as a feminine form of divinity, which is to say, uh, in the biblical, it's in the Bible as Sophia, um, who was
My
there in the
daughter.
big. Nice choice.
If we put your
It's
cat with my daughter.
right there. You go. We've got everything we need.
Yeah.
Um, but as Sophia, it's like it's the matrix out of which the divine creates, you could say. And so rather than coding chaos as evil, we can code it as the all-nourishing abyss, um, the womb, what Plato called the receptacle. And what this allows us to uh, it allows us to relate to creativity in a different way, and relate to challenges to establish order in a different way, as not simply evil, but as just a inevitable part of how divine creativity works. And so rather than just talk about the cosmos, whether we're, I think it was Teilhard who first came up with this term cosmogenesis, in the French equivalent at least. It's like the order by which the universe is created is itself evolving. And so rather than creation being a one-time event, like what the book of Genesis is describing is a eternal process. That process of creation is still happening. And you could also read it as like, well, the sixth day when God created the human being, God basically handed over the reins of the process of creation to the human and said, okay, now you finish it. So God left it unfinished.
Mm.
And so then the human has to step into the right relationship to the task that God has given to us, by choosing Christ instead of choosing self-aggrandizement or power, which is this temptation. Uh, and and so chaosmogenesis then is a term, I'm kind of, so James Joyce, in Finnegan's Wake, came up with this term, um, chaosmos, I believe. And the French post-structuralist philosopher Gilles Deleuze and his psychoanalytic friend Felix Guattari, they use this term as well. And I combined cosmogenesis and chaosmosis, or chaosmos as chaosmogenesis, to signal this new relationship to chaos, not simply as evil, um, but as a divine consort in a way, and that we can understand the Christ impulse then as a attempt to hold the balance between um, order and chaos, to find the right um, middle path whereby we honor creativity while never forgetting the suffering of what's lost in that process, because creation's always destruction, always involves destruction and loss, and the replacing of the old with the new. But what we're I think the Christ impulse is a way of relating to the task of creation lovingly, so that it's not brazen, it's not um, uncaring creativity that says screw what's lost. Uh, it's it's a suffering with everything that's lost, and recognizing that we have to move forward as well. Um, so yeah, that's kind of what's packed into that term.
I just close. My last thing I'll say for myself is this is another, thinking about these ideas and then stumbling back upon non-equilibrium thermodynamics, which I had learned about. Like, I've seen it happen in my lab work as a scientist. I've seen things that are that, you know, I've seen it happen, but it was not something that was ever discussed in any coursework I ever took through a PhD in physics. And I think that actually may say something about these institutional issues that we're talking about. Like, the fact that exactly what you're saying about order and chaos shows up in one of our most sophisticated versions of thermodynamics has been an idea that has been so, like, even I feel like I kind of stumbled upon it myself in the last 3 to 4 months. And it's been one of these maps that I think has to be meaningful because it's been progress for me just in my own life. And the fact that you tied it to the feminine divinity, Matt, is exactly right. Like, I've gone so far as telling my wife lately that I'm, seeing her as like a chaos monster that I have to harvest energy from in order to perpetuate my own existence. And that's actually
how does she respond to that?
Well, she hears a lot of weird stuff for me. So anyway, she gets it. So anyway, that's actually been something that's been a meaningful change in my life, is to connect those ideas together in a profound way.
Nice. Yeah, there's a line in Owen Barfield's book Saving the Appearances where he talks about how in the future it won't be possible. What's that?
A Catholic.
Oh, Barfield was an anthroposophist. His friend Tolkien and Lewis, or Tolkien,
Right. Okay.
they were Catholics, but yeah,
Okay.
but Barfield was whispering anthroposophy into Lewis and Tolkien's ears all the time. But he says in the future, you won't be able to write a scientific textbook without mentioning the incarnation of the logos, right? So he really did see this integration of these of the religious response to the Christ event and our scientific understanding. I think for some of the reasons you're talking to, Adam, about how we think about order and chaos and bringing the moral and the physical back together again, is, I think, the task that is set for us in the 21st century, right? And it's not a retreat. As I understand it, it's not a retreat to a pre-modern way of understanding. It's not, maybe it's meta-modern, but it's a new integration of the personal participatory relationship to creation that religion has provided historically, an integration of that with a scientific way of communicating, that's not removing us from what we're describing, but involving us more deeply in it. So it's a relational way of knowing, right? Where we recognize that how we observe is going to affect how the observed responds to us, right? And so nature is responsive to our way of knowing it, which is totally different from the traditional mechanistic approach to science and the Cartesian epistemology that underlied it. It's a participatory science. Um, so, I think there's so much that I agree with you, Richard, about in terms of the problems. And I think that what you found in the church is something I see a lot of people finding and
I mean, quite a
converting.
revival these days. I was watching Chris Martenson and Eric Weinstein, and Chris Martin said, "Have you heard about this Latin thing that the kids are doing now? It's in Latin."
Right.
And there
Yeah,
was
it's
that Shia LaBeouf interview, where he talked to Bishop Barron. I'm not really, uh, I'm a convert to Catholicism, so I'm not a cradle Catholic. I'm not a uh, enamored of the hierarchy, etc. I tolerate it. And I have grown to respect it in a certain way as just a necessity of an institution, you know.
yeah. Well, we definitely
But
need to we need more trustworthy institutions, and we need to find a way to
yeah,
trust institutions again, and they might
yes,
go hand
for
in
sure,
hand.
for sure, for sure.
Yeah.
But it's that, again, I think people, young people, many people are starting to appreciate that there's value in a form that is impersonal. It's both personal and impersonal, but it's not about you. And
Yeah.
that is it's actually a teaching mechanism, it's an instruction system that has something to teach us.
Well, there's something about like what the university has become where it's an
Yeah.
impersonal institution, whereas I think the church is actually trying to embody a super personal
I like that. Wonderful.
institution
Super
because
personal.
there's a
Yeah.
person at the base of it. There's not a person at the base of the
Right.
scientific conception of the universe,
Right.
um, or the university by which we would come to know that universe. It's very impersonal.
Yeah.
Um,
Sure.
and we, the emphasis on the value of human personhood and the person as the locus of all value ultimately, I
Totally.
think is super important right now for
Yeah.
many reasons. Socially,
Like the
um,
trillions of dollars that we're spending on these data centers and AI, all in the quest of intelligence just breaks my heart.
yeah.
Like, what if can't we see that people are more intelligent than machines? Can't we see that we should really invest and enrich people? But we're in this slave mindset,
Hmm.
of we're going to control things and there's always going to be somebody in control of these computers and these systems, and then we're all going to be taking our knowledge from them. They're going to be telling us what the truth is.
Yeah.
It's so dystopian.
Well, if there's any silver lining or good news, I think this is going to lead to more conversions because people are going to not want to go along with it, and maybe not just to the
Yeah,
Catholic Church, but I mean,
yeah,
just people will realize what's really of value in life and
yeah. I
connect
think
with
we are at an
deeper
interesting
impulses.
crossroads.
Mhm.
That what was it? The way Adam, you and I were talking and said we've arrived at this moment where we have realized that the cost of the Cartesian framework is that you got to get rid of space-time.
Hmm. Mhm.
And
Hmm.
we're definitely at a crossroads where we have a real opportunity to reframe things, right?
Yeah.
So,
See,
um,
I see a lot of these dynamics as like, fragmentation dynamics. And so you get a lot of more actually people looking for community, right? And so that can be a good thing.
yeah,
But it brings me back to the tools, is that I fear that in the absence of new and better tools, these communities won't end up, doing anything with themselves, right? They just sort of either scale into a new institution that has the same problems, or, you know, stay below the threshold where no one ever knows about its existence. So that's the hope for the new tools is, what you said about individuals, right, Richard? Like, not just valuing individuals, but valuing communities, right? And
I
community
mean,
as a integral part of an individual, right? Like, you don't have individuals without communities, but we don't have the tools
yeah,
to really realize those connections.
I I don't need those tools. There are communities that I'm part of today. There really are. They're not in the future. They're here today, and they've actually always been here. They are available to us today. We don't need a new tool to participate in them. I mean,
Well,
we are a little community here, right? Um,
yeah,
Adam and I have been part of this Epsilon Theory Ben Hunt group. I don't know if you've come across that at all.
not
Matt,
yet.
kind of, uh, but it's a community, and Adam and I have been the two that have kind of uh, gravitated to each other through that community. Um, but it is a so-called epistemic community, you know.
Hmm.
It's like the three of us aren't going to be taking care of each other in a storm or,
Right.
like, you know, going and clearing your driveway, or, it's a
Where
different
are you
kind of
each located?
community. I live in Virginia, in Southern Virginia. How
Okay.
about you,
I'm
Matt?
near Indianapolis.
Okay.
Oh,
Wow.
you're
So yeah,
in San Francisco or
I'm in Oakland, right across the bay
Oakland?
from San
Yeah.
Francisco. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're we couldn't
We're
be
pretty
more
spread
sort
apart.
of equidistant across this continent. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Awesome.
You're 100% right, Richard. It's you need that on the ground, boots on the ground community. And then
Yeah.
the future suggests we need some kind of truth establishing community in addition to the boots on the ground community, is what I might say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, it's been a real treat. Thank you.
So much fun.
Abs-
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
hope we can talk again sometime.
Yeah, I would like that, Richard and Adam. Thanks so much. Very interesting to get to know your backgrounds, where you're coming from, what you care about. I enjoyed
Yeah,
this
and
very
I
much.
think this quantum stuff is important, and I think Wolfgang did a service by articulating it the way he did. I know he was a difficult man. I know that personally, but
Mm.
but that stubbornness is also what allowed him to really like oppose the
Right.
the machine, really.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, just appreciate him.
Yeah, likewise. I'm glad to know you have all that material that will be.
Yeah, I'd like to figure out what to do with it someday.
Mm.
All
Well,
right, guys. Thank you.
all right,
Thanks.
Richard, Adam.
See you,
Talk to you
Matt.
guys soon, I hope. Bye-bye.